We've come so far with these characters, my friends. We watched James burn with fever. We watched Diep count coins for cheap pineapples. We watched a whole family pull one man back from the dark. And now, we've reached the end of the road. This is my conclusion to my own take on their story. Built from the heart. The ending I believe they deserve. So pour your tea one last time, and let me bring it home. When we left off, a door had opened. The pineapple seller's small kindness had become a real chance. A relative needed an honest supplier, and she had thought of James and Diep. The question was whether this family could turn that little opening into the life they'd dreamed of. Well, here's what happened. They said yes. But not the way James once would have, charging in alone, carrying everything until it broke him. This time, they sat at the table and planned it together. Diep ran the numbers. James handled the relationships, the part he'd always been good at. Uncle offered his hands for the hard work. Even Grandpa had a role, minding Nye and keeping the home steady. And slowly, it worked. The first order came through, then a second. Small money at first, but honest money, the kind that doesn't make you sick at night. Diep kept her careful notebook, and for the first time, the numbers were moving in the right direction. Here's what I find beautiful about this. They didn't get rich overnight. There was no lottery, no miracle check. Just steady, honest work, shared between people who loved each other. And that's the most real kind of happy ending there is. The kind you build with your own hands. But a new life isn't only built on money. It's built on healing the old wounds. And there was one wound in this family that still hadn't closed. Grandpa. Remember him from the very first day? Sitting by James's bed, whispering, "I'm sorry, son. Because of me, you've suffered so much." That guilt never left the old man. He still believed deep down that his son's illness, the debt, all of it, was somehow his fault. He carried it quietly, the way fathers do. And James began to notice. He saw the way his father hung back at the edge of the family's new joy, as if he hadn't quite earned a place in it. He saw the old man's eyes when no one was watching, and James realized something. The business could recover, the debt could be paid, but his father's heart still needed mending. So, one evening, James decided it was time. Time to say the thing he'd never said. Time to set his father free from a guilt he'd carried far too long. And what happens next is the moment we've all been waiting for. It was a quiet evening. Diep had taken Knee to bathe, and Uncle was out finishing the day's work. James found his father sitting alone on the porch, looking out at nothing, carrying that old weight on his shoulders. James sat down beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then James began. "Dad," he said gently, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it." The old man turned, wary, bracing for blame the way he always did. But James's voice was soft. "All this time, you've been carrying guilt. You think the debt was your fault. You think my illness was your fault? I've watched you punish yourself for months." Grandpa's eyes filled. "If I hadn't needed help, son. If I hadn't been a burden." And here came the words that changed everything. "Stop," James said, taking his father's hand. "You are never a burden. You're my father. Helping you was never the thing that broke me." What broke me was thinking I had to do everything alone. That was my mistake, Dad. Not yours. And even if none of this had ever happened, I would still want you right here at my table, in my home, for the rest of your days. Not out of duty. Because I love you. The old man's face crumpled. Years of guilt, of quiet self-blame, of believing he had ruined his son's life. All of it broke loose at once. "I only ever wanted to be a good father to you," he whispered, and James pulled him into an embrace. You were, he said. You are. You raised a man who learned, finally, how to love his family the right way. That was you, Dad. That was always you. Let me sit with this for a moment. We spend so much of our lives keeping score of who owes what, who failed whom. But love doesn't keep that ledger. Love says, you are mine, and that is enough. And the debt was paid before it was ever owed. That's what James gave his father that night. Freedom. And something shifted in the old man. You could see it. The weight he had carried since that first feverish morning simply lifted. He sat up straighter. He breathed easier. For the first time in a long time, he looked like a man at peace. Just then, little Noah came running out, fresh from her bath, hair still damp. Grandpa, Grandpa, will you read me a story tonight? Once the old man might have waved her off, feeling he didn't deserve the joy, but not now. He smiled, a real, full smile, and pulled her onto his knee. Next time, he used to say. But tonight he said, yes, sweetheart. Right now, come here. A small thing, but it was everything. It was a man finally letting himself be happy. And from the doorway, James and Diep watched, hand in hand. The wounds were closing. The family wasn't just surviving anymore. It was whole. Spring came softly that year. The debt, the one that had started everything, was finally fully paid. Diep closed her careful notebook on the last payment, and for a long moment, the whole family just sat there, hardly believing it. Then Nee broke the silence with a cheer, and the little house filled with laughter. But the money was never really the point. You felt that in the room. What they were celebrating wasn't a number reaching zero. It was everything they had become along the way. James, who had learned to lean on the people who loved him. Diep, who had stepped out of the shadows and become the steady heart of the family's new life. Grandpa, free at last from his guilt. Uncle, always there, always faithful. And Nee, growing up in a home where love was spoken out loud. The secrets were finally gone. No more debt hidden in James's chest. No more guilt buried in his father's heart. No more carrying heavy things alone in the dark. Everything was out in the open now, shared between people who had chosen again and again to face life together. And that was enough. More than enough. James stood at the window one evening and looked at them all. His father reading to Nye, Diep humming in the kitchen, Uncle laughing at something, and he thought, this is the life. This specific, ordinary, complicated, beautiful thing. This is what all of it was for. The fever, the fear, the cheap pineapples, the sleepless nights, all of it had led here. He was not afraid anymore. This is the part that gives me the most hope, my friends. James didn't end up with a mansion or a fortune. He ended up with something no money can buy. A family that knew how to love each other through the worst and was now learning to enjoy each other through the best. On a warm evening in early spring, James and Diep sat together on the front steps, watching the last light fade over the little house that had held them through it all. Inside, Nee's laughter rang out, and Grandpa's gentle voice answered. The pineapples on the table were sweet now, bought not from desperation, but from simple joy. We made it, Diep said quietly, resting her head on his shoulder. James took her hand, the same hand that had counted coins and cooked porridge and never once let go of him. No, he said softly. You made it. You carried us when I couldn't. I just had to learn to let you. She smiled. He smiled. And they sat there in the warm spring dark, two lives woven into one, with their family whole and happy behind them. James didn't need anything more than this. He was just here, present, grateful, and that was more than enough. This was my own take on their story, my friends, what I felt they deserved, and what their journey meant to me. Whether life unfolds this way or another, what matters is the truth at the heart of it, that love and family are worth everything. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Until our next warm story, take care of the ones you love.